If you want to create your own textures from photographs, you have to either use advanced techniques to separate the different passes of light information, or use software that tries to do that for you. Most online material databases nowadays provide a full set of PBR textures per material that you can simply plug into the principal shader the way they are. If you want to create an entirely procedural PBR-based shader, you have to generate all those different maps individually. That can be both an obstacle and an opportunity to integrate additional information. And here I want to go over how to generally approach this. If you want the best of both worlds, you can mix a procedural workflow with traditional elements. We will talk about that in another chapter. An advantage of the procedural approach when you are creating the individual maps is that you don't have to generate one map out of the other, like you have to when using a base photograph. In the node tree that generates your procedural texture map, you have all the successive steps available to create the other texture maps with as well. So you have additional information that helps you to more accurately and independently define the individual PBR maps. What you usually want is to have the different maps inform each other, but not generate one completely out of the information of the other. Doing that usually leads to a very one-dimensional look. We will talk about how to practically mix and blend those maps together more specifically in the next chapter about shader composition. Also, there are more in-depth workflow examples showing the whole process of creating procedural shaders. Here I want to lay the focus on the general idea to generate the different PBR maps and how they usually correlate to one another. Something that you can keep in mind for all the different PBR maps is that a good method of approaching shading in general is thinking logically about the natural properties of the material you are attempting. Whether that may be a surface existing in nature, something artificially created, or anything at all. If you want to achieve a convincing PBR shader, it is important to ground it in reality by thinking about how it would logically occur. That concept even applies for stylized shaders to a certain extent. To give a few examples here, that could be thinking about where dust would be more likely to accumulate, where paint would more easily chip off, or how a floor is worn down by years of use. This line of reasoning ripples through all the levels of PBR maps. Looking at and observing reference is a great way of getting aware of these connections. And details like these, being faithful to the nature of things, is what gives a shader a lot more character and authenticity. The workflow of which PBR map you should start with depends on the material itself. A lot of the time, I personally find myself starting with the height map. As this map gives information over the geometry and the overall structure, it also usually informs the other maps in some capacity. But something you can rely on is that usually you want to develop your shader out of a set of general base textures that are then incorporated in all the individual PBR maps. With these base textures, I mean anything from simple to complex elements, structures, and shapes that the material is made out of. These textures don't have to be very specific, they can be anything, but they should have some sort of association with the final material that you have in mind. To give some examples, those could be a chiseled noise texture for a rocky surface, a gradient along the geometry for a change in wetness, the lines to define the grain of wood, or a single stitch on an embroidery. A procedural shader is usually made up of several of these base textures. Most parameters of the principal BSDF are single values that can be accessed as either a simple constant value or a value map. I want to group these maps together in this section, as they are general value maps that describe the variation of surface properties like metallic, roughness, sheen, etc. If a constant value is not sufficient for these maps, the best way to create a value map is selecting the right base texture and mapping it to a range of the intended values, using either a map range node or a color ramp. That works quite straightforward by selecting the levels of minimum and maximum and the levels those are mapped to. The most important thing about these textures is to respect the PBR context of what those chosen values imply about the material. One of the maps I want to single out here is the color map. Generating color maps is usually a matter of good base textures, as you generally want the base of your color map to only include the actual albedo color without lighting information. It can usually be simply created using the gradients and masks of the base textures. Information like ambient occlusion and variations can be added on top later on. You can simply use a color ramp to turn the base texture into a color map. But something to be cautious of is that especially for the color map, using only a single base texture creates a very one-dimensional look, as I mentioned before. A good way to introduce some variation is to use multiple color ramps and blend between them with a mask from a noise. That gives you a lot of control over the different color configurations this method creates. And even surfaces that seem very uniform usually have some form of variation in their color. In case you are using a color noise as your base texture, you can simply use the 3 RGB channels for this technique. Just use the separate RGB node to split it up. Use 2 of the outputs with color ramps for the color passes and the third one for the mask to blend between them. That automatically introduces some variation that, and this is important, is not depending on one single base texture. You want the variation to be disconnected from the main base texture, otherwise it's applied along the same axis and introduces no additional information. Other PBR maps can also influence and be integrated into the color map. For example, materials that get wet appear darker in those spots. That effect can be essential to the material and can be dynamically connected to the roughness layer that dictates how wet the surface looks. Maps that simply adjust the color map can easily be integrated using a color mix node with the appropriate blend mode on top. Another map that has to be created differently than just mapping values to a range is the infamous normal map. The simplest way to create a normal map in the shader editor is by creating a bump map and using the bump node to convert it into a normal vector map. A bump map is a simple value map that functions similar to the height map to give information about the surface detail. The bump node then effectively calculates the changes in the bump map and returns the normal vectors standing on top of that bumpy surface. Not all detail makes sense to be loaded onto the normal map though. Depending on the resolution that you will observe the shader in, you can, instead of very high frequency detail, just increase the roughness, as that's essentially how the macroscopic detail is represented. Also, the procedural nature of the shader lets you zoom in without pixelation of the map. But that does not mean that your texture has to look good from an arbitrary amount of zoom. That is just not feasible. Focus on making it accurate for a reasonable range of detail for the intended use. Into the other extreme, more large-scale surface detail might be better to be included in the geometry, for example by using a height map for displacement. If you are choosing to use a displacement, you can also alternatively refrain from using a normal map at all and instead use the displacement map directly to take care of the surface detail at the same time. You do that by selecting displacement and bump in the displacement settings of the material. That way, depending on the level of subdivision, the detail is either taken care of by the displacement itself or by the generated normal map. The height map is also a map that I want to talk about separately here. A height map has a very specific geometrical association with the material. That means that to be accurate, it has to be addressed more carefully than some of the other maps. That is also true for the normal map, but because they are so strongly connected, I want to show it for the height map specifically. An easy way to precisely control the profile of a height map is using a linear gradient and controlling it with an RGB curves node. That works in the exact same way that we have been doing this for creating shapes earlier, but now the map values can be used as the height directly. You can combine this technique with all the other methods of controlling values in shapes that you have seen and precisely generate height maps that way. But of course, you don't have to only use precise shapes. You can also use noise textures, for example, for the height map. And even here, an RGB curves node can offer some useful control. You can control the profile of the noise to pronounce it in a very specific way. A height map can also be a great way to combine other PBR maps depending on the geometrical properties of the material, even when you're not planning to use it for the displacement itself. I will elaborate on this in the next chapter about shader composition. Something I want to point out as a conclusion is that you want to keep in mind what information you use where when you're creating the individual PBR maps from the base textures. This goes hand in hand with what I mentioned multiple times throughout the video. When you create multiple maps from the exact same information, it might look one-dimensional and artificial. I wanted to quickly pick up this point again under the term of correlation. Correlation, loosely speaking, describes to what magnitude two or more things have a reoccurring relationship. For example, when I simply use the height map to define the color map and nothing else, then every spot with the same height also has the exact same color. Some level of correlation is a good thing, as you want the different PBR maps to support and correspond to each other. But also, you usually want some variation. That highly depends on the material, but it is definitely something to think about.